right. Welcome everyone to this session here with IRRE. We're here to walk you through our webinar from talking the talk to walking the walk, implementing instructional innovations rather. I am Randall Lober, and with me here is my colleague Anissa Collins. We'll introduce ourselves in more detail a little bit moment. For now, we're going to ask you to join Pear Deck and use that to facilitate some interaction today. We'll use it in two different ways. One, to serve as your own personal thought journal as you track some thinking and responding throughout the session, but also a semi-private journal in that we'll peek in from time to time. And if there are some really interesting threads that we'd like you to either expand on, or that we're noticing some experiences that you have in common with other folks, we certainly want to highlight those. So it's your personal thought journal, but also a way to network some of the thinking that you have as well. So please either direct your browser or a second device to joinpd.com and input that code QDMALZ. We'll give you just a moment to do that. That code will be projected up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen throughout the session if that went too fast. And Anissa it does have that for you in chat. So we'll give you just a moment to input that code before we go forward. All right, and we're off. So we're talking about what it takes to implement instruction innovations. I am Randall Lober, a senior instructional specialist with IRRE. My role is to help support teachers and leaders on various levels in doing good things better. I serve as a coach and a technical advisor where necessary, depending on the scope of the project. And with me today is Dr. Anissa Collins.
All right, hi everybody. As Randy said, my name is Anissa Collins. I'm the Director of Instructional Supports. And like Randy, I work with teachers and leaders across the country to help build their internal capacity so that we as adults can serve the kids as best as we can.
And speaking of internal capacity, that's what today's session is all about. So we want to think about how we as learners and as adult learners develop our own capacity with new skills and new strategies. So we have two outcomes we want to attend here today. We want to first be able to describe a continuum of comfort and capability in implementing new practices. And we also want to identify some strategies to support your learning implementation of a new practice. So place yourself on the continuum and then figure out, well, how do I even get even better than where I am right now? We'll begin and end on time. We do have some time scheduled at the end for a question and answer session, but if there are not many questions and answers, then we may even end a few moments early. Please stay focused throughout between your conversation in chat or in Pear Deck. We ask that you turn your phone over or do whatever keep your phone because you'll use it for Pear Deck. But we ask that you otherwise stay focused or do whatever you make adjustments to your space to be able to stay focused here with us. Please be respectful as people share that thinking. We all come here with our own truths and our own experiences. So we also ask that you assume positive intent. You're also either here with us live here today or viewing this as a recording because you want to learn more about your own learning. And that is a noble purpose and a noble goal. So let's assume that we're all coming to each other and coming to this space with that background. In the chat feature, please use questions and responses there or use the raise hand function down at the bottom of your Zoom window. And you don't have a choice here in the webinar because you are muted. But just as a reminder to Anissa and anyone who unmutes at the end for some questions or answers to mute your microphone when you are not speaking. Some other housekeeping things to attend to. So please share your questions and ideas in the chat. In the classroom, we typically go, no, don't talk. But here's where we get a chance to see your thinking. And those back channel conversations are a powerful learning tool. So please keep that conversation flowing. We'll track and respond to those questions at logical pausing points at that Q&A session near the end, as I discussed, or in follow-up communication if for some reason we're not able to attend to it within the session. And just so you are aware, the chat will also be saved and recorded, so we can follow up on any unanswered questions or comments. It allows us to compile some resources anything that you share that we can send out in the recap of this session. So we'll start here. We're talking about moving from talking the talk to walking the walk of instructional innovations. And we'll ask you first, we know in the past year, you've adapted a lot of new practices. Some of them have stuck with you. They found a put in place in your repertoire. Some of them have fallen to the wayside. You've tried it or you heard about it and said, sounds nice, but not for me. So we'd like you to get some of that thinking out in Pear Deck or on paper. Take a minute to think about, over the past year, what have you implemented, what's stuck with you, and what's fallen to the wayside? Give you another moment or so to think about that thinking. We see some responses about Pear Deck, the tool we're using here. Some responses about breakout rooms and how those have been hard to implement. Some thinking about Google Classroom. Go ahead and finish up that thought. And let's go ahead and, so with that principle or that practice in mind, go ahead and keep that at the front of mind. We'll use that as a vehicle for exploring this continuum that we spoke of, as well as think about strategies about how we might improve in that particular area of our practice. So Jim Knight is a researcher in the field of instructional coaching and in providing professional learning for teachers. And one thing we really like about his work, and he's updated it here in 2021, given everything that's happening in the past year in the education world. And one of the things we appreciate about the update is these 5 stages of implementation of professional learning or skills or behaviors that we go through as education professionals. Moving from non-use all the way at the bottom of that continuum, all the way up to most proficient use at the top, where we're really confident and competent in our implementation with that skill or that piece of technology or whatever, what have you. So what we wanted to do is spend a few moments here at the beginning of the session to outline those 5 stages in more detail before in the back half we talk about, so, okay, now what? How do I move through some of those stages? So the first stage we want to be aware of is non-use. That's at the bottom of Knight's continuum. And as the name implies, that means that you are not implementing a strategy or a skill. And that might be because you're unable, you haven't heard of it. There's the mute symbol there, right? You haven't heard of something, you either were not there for the professional learning session, you haven't seen Pear Deck used somewhere, so you're not aware of it. And so you're simply not implementing because you just don't know any better. So, and if you don't know better, you can't do better yet. So there's one case where you might be not implementing. The other thing to be attentive to is people who are unwilling to implement something. And that might come across an active resistance, as in the shoving papers to the side and say, I'm not going to do this. Or it might be the more passive resistance, where we go through the motions and we seem to accept it while we're there in the moment. But we know that when we go, if they go back to the classroom or go back to wherever their practice area is, that implementation won't find, or that skill, that strategy won't make its way into practice. We want to stop also to point out that resistance doesn't always connote a bad thing, right? Sometimes people will resist for a lot of what they perceive as good reasons, whether that's the perception of whatever they are doing that seems to be working, whether that is a bit of a change fatigue or a bit of a sense of this too shall pass, so if I don't do it, I can do something else. So it is incumbent upon us as leaders and coaches to really interrogate some of that thinking behind that unwillingness. And if you're a teacher in that spot and you are unwilling to implement a strategy or a skill that's being asked of you, it's important to examine your own thinking and think a little bit about how am I resisting and what's the source of my resistance here.
And Randy, the other thing that I just wanted to point out for those of you guys that are leaders, that unable or unaware can also apply not just to our whole faculties because, you know, they can't implement something they don't know, but it also makes us think about when we do have professional learning and somebody's not there. Well, how do we really help support those teachers that may miss a professional learning opportunity that the rest of the faculty has, so that we can have that common understanding of a particular strategy or initiative, whatever that might be, so that they can help support each other and that everybody's on the same page.
Mm-hmm. So how do we bring everyone to awareness? The second stage on the continuum is still not not implementing, but we are aware of the strategy. So I used awareness in a few moments ago very intentionally. These are people who may not be resistant to the skill, to the strategy, to the change, but they're unclear of how to put it into practice. There's a knowing doing gap. So they might be excited about a change. They might be able to talk about that change, but they just don't know what it looks like. They can't visualize it for their own work. They're not quite yet fluent with implementing breakout rooms or structuring conversations within those breakout rooms. And unfortunately, the farther away they get from that initial time where they first hear about it, that excitement starts to wane. They become a little bit less and less likely to implement whatever the new change or strategy might be. So people in the awareness stage are not resistant, they're eager, they're on board, but they don't yet have all the tools or all the knowledge they need to be able to implement the skill or strategy with regularity. So we'll ask you to think for a minute here and reflect on either the practice that you identified earlier, whether that's Pear Deck, Google Slides, Google Classroom, breakout rooms, whatever that happened to be, and knowing that there's more steps for, a little bit later on the continuum. What types of supports might be helpful when moving from awareness to mechanical implementation? So how do we move someone from just being aware of a strategy to giving it a try? Go ahead and jot some thinking in Pear Deck for us, please.
And for the folks who have just joined us recently, in the chat bar, there is the web address and the code for Pear Deck if you want to join along for both the responses and individual note taking.
I'm seeing some of your thinking coming in, things like follow-up conversations in either small groups. So I think thinking about that maybe with the department level team to think about how that strategy might look for them. Think about pairing them with an instructional coach perhaps, and really teasing out the thought process and helping that and having that coach help them visualize what it looks like. And certainly one thing that it can't be overlooked is modeling the strategy itself, right? So if we're teaching a new strategy about breakout rooms, or a conversation structure within breakout rooms, it's a really good idea to have teachers experience that structure for themselves, so they can kind of poke holes in it and noodle it around and say, that's not so bad. Maybe I can go ahead and give this a try. And here I now have some of the tools or some of the technical ability, like knowing where the breakout room button is, to be able to implement this. So thank you for sharing that thinking. And again, the thinking that you share will come back to you at the end of the session as a slideshow in a follow-up email, as well as for those of you that have not used Pear Deck before, you'll get a kind of a journal, recording of all your responses that comes back to you a little bit later on here as well. So the third stage of the continuum is the mechanical stage. So we've moved from awareness to now we're trying to implement, but implementing feels awkward, and we have the awkward emoji there for good reason. But that implementation can be a struggle. It requires a lot of memory. Okay, how exactly do I do the breakout rooms? Am I going to, how do I break them up into groups of 4? What do I do if there's only 3 people in a group? How can I make this flexible, right? So you really have to pay attention to a lot of the nuances, a lot of the details in implementation, and a lot of your working memory gets clogged up with those details. And especially if you haven't figured out some of those structural things or all the implementation things, you might struggle with the various parts of the strategy. And as all of us in the education field know, the first time we try something is not usually the best try. As professional learning providers, back in last March when we made the pivot to more virtual supports, the first time we tried breakout rooms was a hot mess. It does not achieve the desired results here, right? And at this stage, there's a big and huge potential for abandoning the change. Oftentimes, we can be discouraged by that first time not going well, so we don't see the value in trying again. Or worse yet, educators that we're asking to try a specific strategy or approach don't see the value. They were once bitten and twice shy here by the strategy, and it just didn't go well. So that's one thing to be aware of, is that persistence is certainly of the key here whenever we're trying something new. Vanessa?
Yeah, and the other thing, Randy, really good points. The other thing, just to add into that, is that at the very beginning of this mechanical use stage, there can be a lot of imitating of whatever they saw modeled. And so as we think about sharing strategies with our peers or leading a professional development session, that modeling and modeling it very precisely is really, really key. Because if we model it in a kind of a lesser way than it's really going to be effective in the classroom with kids, then at this stage, when the teachers are really trying it, they're going to do it exactly as they saw it. Because that's as far as they're able to really figure it out yet, because they just don't have that experience. So just keeping that in mind as well. If we're talking to our peer about it, modeling in the classroom or in PD, making sure that we're as crystal clear in that modeling as possible.
Modeling is effective and certainly can help to bridge that gap for some folks. So as we think about the mechanical stage, what we just discussed here, what are some pitfalls presented by that stage, and what might that say about the supports that educators need to keep moving along the continuum? So please take a moment to jot some thinking in Pear Deck or on your own as you like. And your responses are in motion here, but if I can make an inference, some of you are along the lines of, well, this is a chance for as we talked about, a lot of falling off, right? This is where some changes might sputter because the first time or two through or using the strategy didn't quite work so well, and so teachers might shy away from it. What we also are seeing in the responses is the ideas that talk about more modeling and certainly the idea of providing feedback, right? So if we're asking teachers to try a new strategy, to get into the classroom, to observe how that practice is going, and to provide them some coaching, some feedback around what's going well, what's not, and what some adjustments, and reflect with them about what some adjustments might need to be made. Certainly, one other interesting thing coming out of your responses is the idea of peer visits. So if I know that I'm having trouble with the strategy, I can go visit one of my peers to help me get a better sense of what more effective implementation looks like. And that's kind of gives away the game for a little bit of what we'll talk about later, but we'll certainly come back to that. After we've gotten kind of comfortable with the mechanics of a strategy, we then move to the routine phase of implementation. I am represented by the fireplace here. We get comfortable with the strategy of the skill. We implement it in structured, quick, and easy to remember ways. I'm always going to do a breakout room. It's always going to be groups of 2, and it's always going to be for 30 seconds each. Go ahead and talk. And we get really hesitant to stretch beyond that routine. So there's a comfort, there's a sense of routine here in the routine phase. And so we intend to do things one way, or the way that's quick and easy to remember for us. But the thing about routines is it can bring a danger of false clarity. So if I, as a teacher, as a professional learning provider, only conceive of the strategy as a breakout room can only be 2 students for 30 seconds and don't ever allow for any variety in that, there's a bit of an oversimplification of the strategy, and we end up knowing less than we think we do. And that might lead to positive results, right? We still have students talking to each other, they're sharing thinking, but it might not be a sustained change, right? We might get bored, students might get bored with that particular implementation of a breakout room. And certainly if people are feeling bored in that routine, we're not going to get optimal results. We're not going to get the same value in conversation. We're not going to see the same level of engagement either from students or from the teacher in designing those activities. So there's that big danger of false clarity. We might not move the needle there as much as we might like when teachers are practicing at this phase. So we'll ask you to think about the last year. We've all had to change the way we do business in many ways over the past year. What are some things you've implemented, and for which of those might you identify as a routine implementer, and why might you identify that way? Let's go ahead and jot some thinking in Pear Deck or on your own, whatever the case might be. So some of us are talking about this slew of apps that we all learned this year. Flipgrid was and is still a hot new thing. If you haven't heard of it, I highly encourage you to check it out. It allows you to record sort of video prompts. It allows students to have video conversations, so it really helps in those asynchronous days, or that asynchronous learning. But oftentimes, as when you mentioned here, we only use it in a reflective capacity. And that's great to have students reflect on their learning and do some metacognition, but that's the only way we might be using it. So we might be looking for some ways to branch out to find, so students don't make that association between, oh, it's Flipgrid time, it's time to talk about my feelings, right? And then instead think a little bit about some other ways to use the tool, how to have some more dialogue between students. I'm sometimes thinking about, before we moved to distance learning, pair shares. A lot of us in our classrooms, we always had people sitting next to each other, or even now in a distance classroom, we might have people on opposite ends of a long table, which means if you're going to do a pair share, you're probably only talking to the person at the other end of your table, right? So trying to find some ways to vary that structure and vary who we participate with. So we're working with and getting a variety of perspectives as we think about those strategies. The last stage in Knight's model of implementation is the proficient stage. And of course, here we're still implementing, but that is involves a deep understanding of the skill or strategy, the ideas of how it can or should be modified for individual contexts. So if I'm going to be using breakout rooms and I'm really technically fluent of that, I might want a group of 4 of my kids to engage in some extended brainstorming at the beginning of a larger project. But when it comes down to peer editing and getting some feedback, I really might want a pair of kids to talk together so they can have a really deep conversation about that. So my implementation of that strategy is really fluent and adaptable to the needs of the learning at that moment. And from the outside, if I were to come in and visit the classroom of someone who is implementing something proficiently, that implementation looks effortless. But we all know that good teaching is not effortless. It's a product of our learning, our practice, and our experimentation that we've done along the way. I use the rolling pin there as a graphic and kind of a helping reminder because I probably, like many of you, became a pandemic baker. And my first few attempts at pandemic bread and trying to roll it flat and all that kind of things was a mess. And then I learned that, as I watched videos, and there was the realization that this is probably that person's thousandth loaf of bread that they're making. This is my third. So acknowledging that it shouldn't be effortless for me yet, that it can't look that smooth, and I haven't quite developed those gluten networks the same way. It is something for us to know as well. So from the outside, things look easy, right, for professional implementers, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in here to make that implementation work and go well. So if you are a leader, or if you are someone that visits your peers as a regular part of your practice, what differences might you observe or note when visiting a routine user versus what you might see when visiting a proficient user of a strategy? Please go ahead and jot some thinking in Pear Deck or wherever is appropriate for you. So as I interpret some of the shorthand here, or some of the responses in progress, I'm seeing the idea that proficient users, students know exactly what to do. There seems to be some sort of routine in place. There's the sense that we've been there and done that before, right? Sometimes we also have evidence of the teacher modeling and explaining the strategy. The response here doesn't necessarily differentiate between whether they would see that in a routine or proficient classroom, but I would argue that that probably happens in both. Where we are really making those explanations clear to children. We also know that one thing that is highlighted here is that idea of being flexible. Oftentimes, a proficient user will be more flexible and be able to respond to either changes in group composition. We know there's students that get pulled for interventions or what have you. So being able to try and respond to those things that are on the moment. And when something doesn't work, the idea that teachers switches gears. So the idea that of recognizing that something might not be working the way we had envisioned it, and knowing that there might be some tweaks to get more performance and more engagement out of our students based on the strategy here. Vanessa, you are unmuted, which means you have something to say.
Oh, nope, actually, I just forgot to mute myself.
Oh, okay. Thank you all for sharing your thinking here, and that's why I'm looking off to the side, because I have your responses over here on this screen. So yeah, those are some differences. We see some differences in quality, and there's a difference. You can sense almost that the different levels in confidence and competence that the teacher has and projects when they're executing that strategy. So these are those five stages of implementation, all back together again, starting from non-use at the bottom, moving up to awareness, to mechanical use, to routine use, and proficient use. And so you may be wondering, so great, I'm a mechanical user. What happens next? How do I get better? And the back half of our hour today, we'll spend some time talking about some strategies for moving up that continuum. We'll name them here first before we go into some more detail. They are persistence, acknowledging that transfer problem, acknowledging that gap, explicit teaching of new behaviors to either your adult learners or to your child learners, I guess is the best way to put that. Understanding the importance of underlying theory, proactive and productive use of peers, and flexibility. So we'll speak some more about each of those six as some different strategies to help you or others that you might be supporting move on their own continuum with a specific skill. First among those, as we talked about earlier, is persistence. The idea of practice makes perfect. We practice, we practice, we practice. Especially when things don't work the first time, it doesn't mean the strategy is faulty. We instead would ask you or the educators you support to re-examine their planning. What structure did we have in place or not have in place, and did we communicate that structure effectively to students? What might have been changed about the implementation in terms of materials management, or in terms of making sure that students, the question was visible for students that they moved into breakout rooms and that everyone knew what it was they were supposed to discuss. So looking at some of those structural things before that we made, structural decisions and choices that we made before throwing the baby out with the bathwater with the strategy. The other thing to keep in mind is that persistence is a good gateway from awareness to routine use, right? So if we're going to bridge that gap, going from I've heard of this strategy to now I can kind of do it at the mechanical stage to moving all the way up to routine use and incorporating it regularly. One of the fastest ways to get there is by practicing, to make a regular commitment to saying, you know what, that first time I tried breakout rooms didn't go so well. I'm going to try it a slightly different way or try to add some clarity to my direct expectations or my ask of kids. And with time and additional support can lead to proficient use with the strategy. And we want to note that many times we're not proficient at using a strategy right away. It does take time. It does take multiple attempts. And it may often take additional support, whether that's your building leader or a coach that sits in, or a colleague that sits in on your room and says, hey, what if we tried it this way? Or what if we made this adjustment? How might that impact student engagement? That can help move us up that continuum to proficient use.
And Randy, as we're thinking about persistence, it's persistence of us, the adults, but it's also helping the kids be persistent in trying it as well. And one of the things that we've heard from educators across the country, and I think Randy and I both have done in our own classrooms as well, is, being honest with kids when we try something for the first time. It's like, hey, I want your feedback. What worked well, what didn't work well. So that persistence and having the kids be part of that persistence is really helpful.
It is, and we'll speak more about that in a bit, and how students can support us in this learning journey. The second thing we need to do is acknowledge the transfer gap and know and put on a sticky note somewhere in front of us that learning is not the same as doing. We can be aware of things, but still not know how to do them. So when we think about that aware stage from the continuum, we might be aware of something, but we don't quite know how to do it. And this can look a few different ways. We can possess the book knowledge. We might be really well read in a strategy. We could tell you the in and outs, and we could visualize how to make that breakout room happen. But actually, when that plan hits the battlefield, for some reason, it's falling apart for us, right? It's not implementing. It's not going the way we want it to. So recognizing that there's a gap between knowing something and being able to do it, being able to implement it well, and working out all those kinks is an important thing. And once we know and we're reminded of that fact that learning is not the same as doing something, that can take some pressure off of us to feel like we have to have it perfect the first time, that we are still working through this knowing doing gap. And now that we know we have learned better, we are learning how to do better as well.
And Randy, also just to add on to that, learning is not the same as doing, reminds me of what somebody had mentioned in terms of modeling, whether that's in PD or in the classroom, and I had mentioned it as well. And there's that, it comes back to that. We might actually have been a learner of it and used it ourselves in PD. But if it's not modeled for us or broken down like a spotlight of, how do you do this? Then we've experienced it on one level as a learner, but we haven't experienced it or thought about it and processed it as the educator or as the leader. And so I think that's really something to keep in mind, of that transference from knowing to doing. Is it's not just the theory, but it's knowing the steps behind it as well, so that we can really do it in our classroom and ourselves.
Making that implementation steps really clear for ourselves and having that clarity to be able to implement. So Anissa spoke a little bit earlier about how students can support us in our learning journey, and we have to help them support us, right? We can't just say, kid, do this thing, right? We have to be explicit in teaching those new behaviors that we want them to do. And be aware that their experience can change too, especially when we're asking them to implement new tech, if they're on an asynchronous day or whatever, whatever format your district or building has working in at the moment. Just be aware that change might be uncomfortable for them. So you might get some resistance on that level. But that does require us to teach and model some new cognitive and social expectations in support of your learning of the practice. So if we are asking them to engage in a virtual jigsaw, right? We'll need to model some of that note taking and model what happens in expert groups with them, so they can feel fluid and comfortable in the strategy and they know what they're expected to do. And the last bullet says, when students know what to do, it becomes easier for them to practice and for us to practice. And when it's easier for us to practice, we're more likely to keep implementing. Meaning that the more explicit we are up front, the more that we can tell students what they need to do and what they need to know to be able to participate in the strategy. And if we can be clear on that, the likelihood is for them to be able to do that well, which means we're going to find more value and be even more empowered to implement that strategy well.
And this actually reminds me of a group of teachers that we worked with, math teachers that were trying a new problem-solving type of strategy with the kids. And what they realized is they were all using something, but it was all different, both between the grade level as well as in between the grade levels in the building. And so together as a team, and I know Brandy's going to talk about how to use our peers to help support us. But as a team, what they did is they came together to say, we're all going to try this new strategy and we're all going to explain it this way. And that way, then that explicit teaching, not only in one class, but in multiple classes, really allowed the kids to learn it better. And as Randy had said, when they know what to do, that's easier for us to practice as well. So that's not just our own selves, but within a collective team as well.
Thank you. So we've talked about 3 of those 6 so far. I'll ask you to take a moment in Pear Deck to just reflect for a moment. Which of those strategies that we've talked about so far seem to resonate with you in the work that you're doing? So as I look at some of what's coming in, we see ideas about that transfer problem, knowing that there's a difference between cognitively knowing what I should do and being able to implement that. We also saw some thinking, again, about that teaching those expectations to students. And oftentimes we can think we're clear in our explanations, but I'm sure if we were to reflect, we might always find another tweak that we might offer for students to make that next implementation of the strategy go even smoother next time around. So some things to be aware of there. And the idea of being persistent, right? So one of that seemed to resonate one of you, knowing that we'll be held accountable in some way for implementing a strategy, right? And so knowing that I have to get better, I want to see results for my students, and this strategy it has proven to be effective elsewhere. If I keep trying, if I keep doing it, I'll get better at it too, and produce some results for my students as well. So thank you for pausing and reflecting with us there. We'll talk about the next three strategies here on the back end of that. One thing that is critical for adults, and I would argue students to know too, but one thing that's critical for adult learners is knowing the why, understanding the underlying theory or rationale behind the strategy, the skill, whatever it is we're asking them to do. And knowing the why makes that success more likely. So if an adult is able to articulate the rationale, they're able to say that this is good for kids because, if they're able to see the value, this will help support my students in these ways, and they can see that connection to student learning, they're more likely to buy in. If they can say, that does make a difference for our kids. I do see that working for my subject area. I do see this working for my age level. They're more likely to implement that, where they can find that relevance for themselves. And this is oftentimes the barrier between mechanical use and upper levels of use. Mechanical educators who are working at a mechanical use are kind of stuck in those. They're doing a lot of that rote thinking. They're spending a lot of their cognitive energy on the what students should be doing, but they're not thinking so much about the why they're doing that. Yeah. So when we can help them make that connection, when we can help them see why sticking with breakout rooms is important for that student voice and that dialogue, that can help them move up another level or so on that continuum to really foster their own learning. We've alluded to it a few times, but we want to be very explicit that another way to get better at doing something is to not go it alone, to be proactive and productive in the use of peers. And we want to be very intentional in saying that peers doesn't necessarily mean just the people in your building, in your grade level, or even here in the age of Twitter and all the other social networks we have, even in your district, right? You might be able to reach out across continents or otherwise expanding your own professional learning network to engage in some mutual problem solving. Hey, I've tried breakout rooms in this way. Hey, Twitter, what are some of your best tips for that? Or what are some of your best tips for facilitating this type of discussion? Or what are some other strategies that we can use instead of the A/B conferencing that we have been doing? Bringing it back to your own building, you might be able to think about some collaborative teaching and planning. So working with those at your grade level or team level to say, here's a good place for this strategy to fit. Let's try this together and see what results that yields. Certainly talking with others and reflecting on them, getting some support and helping them, or rather having them help you kind of pick apart your thinking and your thought process as you design and implement that lesson can be helpful. And again, we can stress that we can look in the same grade band and subject, but that doesn't have to be necessarily limited to your own personal local geography. The internet is a vast and wonderful and sometimes wild place, and there are plenty of people out there, thought leaders in a variety of department areas or content areas and fields that are happy to support your thinking as well.
And I think the other thing, Randy, we had mentioned it earlier about the peer visits, that's really helpful, as well as that idea of asking for help. I think we don't take anywhere near as much advantage of asking if we happen to have a coach in our building or district, or talking to any of our instructional leaders or any of our peers that we know do that, has used that strategy. So absolutely asking for help, not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength.
Absolutely. And as a shameless plug, we're always here too. So if you need help with something, please feel free to reach out to Randy or Anissa, or whoever happens to be servicing your team. And we're always happy to help. That's part of our mission, is to help schools do good things better. The last thing of the strategies we'll talk about today is the idea of flexibility, or that can-do spirit. So what do I need to be able to do to meet the needs of students in front of me? As we've talked with educators in the past year, but and certainly in the time before that, there's always a sense that these kids they're coming to us with something different. They're talk about these kids generally. Um, or there's the idea, especially in this time of racial reckoning that America is going through, and your community might be going through. The recognition that what we have tried in the past may not be appropriate for right now. So thinking about how we can meet the ideas or the needs of the students who are with us right here today. So being able to inquire about that and explore and do some thinking about what that might mean to be able to meet their needs. Willingness to experiment with a variety of strategies to incorporate more voice and choice and honor some of those experiences in our classrooms through those strategies, and being open to the evidence for alternatives. So knowing that there are many ways to skin a cat, and knowing that someone else's way may be a little more effective in the particular situation that you're in. So being able to seek those people out and see how they're approaching some of these tougher issues or some of these conversations that you might be faced with as you are trying to navigate your own practice to do better for students.
Absolutely. And, I think that pre-COVID flexibility was a bit more of an issue with some schools just in general. And now it's the flexibility that educators seem to have shown for the last year is just absolutely amazing to me. So it's just that idea of continuing to experiment as we get into our classrooms again, as we're trying to figure out how to do collaborative work in social distancing together. Just that idea of being flexible and thinking outside of the box sometimes of how do I make this work for the kids because I know it's good for the kids.
Mm-hmm. And that that last thought on this I had kind of shows how some of these strategies work hand in hand, right? I don't know if it's good if I don't know the underlying theory, right? So it may be that if we see an educator that is struggling with implementation, that we might need to pick 2 or 3 of these to come to to support them with. If we help them understand the underlying theory, then we can think about different ways to be flexible with that strategy. So those 6 strategies that in total, one more time, are persistence, acknowledging that transfer problem. There's a difference between knowing and doing. Being explicit with teaching our students new behaviors and new routines. Helping our adult learners to understand the importance of the underlying theory and understanding why that work is good for kids. Reaching out to our peers and being able to use them to support us, either locally or in a broad geographical sense. And again, being flexible as well. So as we've talked about those 6 strategies, which of them might be most helpful in moving you one step closer to routine use in specific practice? Many of you, as I read the responses, are talking about persistence. The idea that, this is a weird time to be an educator, and if I just keep going along, I'm going to figure it out eventually. And I agree. Keep being persistent. The idea of using peers and reaching out to people, the people around you to be able to support you. Though it may feel it sometimes if you are, have to be teaching remotely today, you may feel isolated behind your desk or at your kitchen table as you're engaged in pandemic teaching. But there is a network of at least a few educators in your own building that can support you with this. They're going through the same thing. That may be struggling with some of those same strategies. And the idea, again, going back to persistence of just keep swimming, right? Being able to figure it out and getting it done because we know it's the work that has to be done for our kids. As we move to our closure today, we want to bring your thinking together here one last time. How would you describe the role that others play in your learning journey, and what might you need from them in order to ensure success? So as I see your responses, one thing is acknowledging the role of students. So for some of you, that idea of student supports and being explicit in their routines. The students are a huge part of your learning journey when you're trying something new. So being able to support them and get some honest feedback with them can be helpful. The idea that, another thing I see in your response is the idea that when someone comes to your classroom, They are able to provide you some feedback and facilitate some reflection with and for you about how the strategy is going and where you might make some tweaks for that. The idea of modeling, again, is important. So when I'm first becoming aware of a strategy, to see it done well and done right the first time, so I have an idea of what proficient use looks like, so I can move there. And again, not being the only one trying something. So maybe it's something working as a department or grade level team. So there's a sense of we're in this together. So I can use my peers as a tool and a resource to really brainstorm and reflect around what's working well and what's not working for us. As we come to an end here, the last few moments we have reserved for some Q&A time from you. We do want you to note that when we end this session here, your browser will be directed to a feedback survey. So please go ahead and fill it out. Let us know a little bit about how we did today and how this session met your needs, or where we might need to make some refinements. If you have some questions, now will be the time to do so, to go ahead and plug them in chat or otherwise, or use the raise hand feature. And on the feedback survey, you'll be asked for an exit ticket. We'll ask you to think about these two questions. How might the knowledge from this session impact your work? And what supports might you need to make that impact? Whether that's from us or from someone else, where might you get some of those supports? Anissa, do you have any parting words before we go ahead and open up to Q&A from the group?
Well, actually, I had a question that was private messaged me in the chat.
Okay.
And that is, if we felt like, you know, this is obviously good for leaders to know and coaches, but what about with teachers, with faculty? Because we had some teachers on here. It's like, you know, is this something that can or should be shared with teachers? So I'm absolutely yes.
Yes. So yeah. So the Jim Knight works a lot in professional learning field, and has a lot of writing about coaching and what makes that effective. But yeah, as Anissa said, yes, share this with teachers when they can articulate where they are on the continuum, and they have the idea of, I need this strategy can help me move me up and move me forward. That self-awareness and being able to talk in that same common language about, I'm at X spot with this particular practice and I need some support in this way, and go a real long way toward making some refinements and adjustments for kids.
Okay, that's all I had in the chat. That was the only question that came up, so.
Okay. Well, then if there are no other questions, we are happy to give you back a bit of your afternoon. There is a lot of ways you could have spent your Tuesday afternoon, but you chose to spend it here with us, and we thank you for that. We look forward to seeing you the first Tuesday of every month here in these sessions, but you're welcome to contact us on Twitter. Our handle's down there at the bottom, or if you're a current partner, you do have Anissa and I's email addresses as well. So please feel free to reach out to us in any way that makes most sense to you.
All right, that's it. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, guys. It's been great. Been great being with you this afternoon, and good luck as you move through your own continuum into that proficient use of whatever strategy you may be working on.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone. We'll see you soon.